Hi class, Lab 45 is very much like Lab 44. We are dealing with parallel rays once again. In this program, we are going to write some code that reads in the rainfall for each of the 12 months and outputs the month and the rainfall for the month. It should then output the month with the most rainfall, the month with the least rainfall, and the total amount of rainfall for the year, and the average monthly rainfall. So we have some computing we need to do. All rainfall amounts should be output with 2 significant digits after the decimal point. So we're going to be reading in values that represent rainfall amounts, and we're going to be validating that data. You can assume that I will provide you the right number of inputs, meaning that you will have 12 valid values for each corresponding to each of the months. So in this example, we're reading in a 3.2, and we are supposed to be validating that the data is good data. So the data that's bad data we're going to overwrite, but the good data we're going to keep. So this 3.2 will be the first element in our rainfall array, and that will correspond to January's rainfall. So what you need to know here is this program should incorporate 2 parallel arrays: month of type string and rainfall of type double. So our array of strings will have in it months of 0 will be January, months of 1 will be February, months of 2 should be March, months of 3 should be April, and so on. Create your array of strings called month using an initialization list. So much like we did on the student name array, we used an initialization list for our student name and our days of week array. Do the same thing, but this time initialize the elements with the strings January, February, March, and so on. The program should read in the rainfall amount for each month using a loop. Do not accept negative numbers for the rainfall amount. Okay, so that's what I was showing you here in this input. These are the rainfall amounts. You can assume that you will have in your input data for all 12 months. But you do have to validate that you are reading in data for the rainfall amount that is greater than or equal to 0. So in other words, here we're reading in a rainfall amount. We're reading this into our rainfall array. Now we're going to use a do while to validate it, and if the value that we read into our rainfall array is not greater than 0, in other words, it's a negative number, well, we're just going to go ahead and read in another number at that same location. So we're going to have a nested do while inside a for loop to validate our data. And then when we do get in a valid number, as in 3.2, well, we're going to go to the next iteration of our for loop so that we can index into our rainfall array and read into it another value, another rainfall amount. Well, this is valid data, so that's going to stay at rainfall sub 1. The next value we try to read into is rainfall sub 2, and that will be March's rainfall. But because this is invalid data, it's less than 0, we need to go ahead and overwrite it with the next value. So we read in another value, negative 0.9. It's also less than 0, so we're going to read in another number. So this value gets read into rainfall sub 2, and it gets to stay there because it passes our validation test. It is good data, so we'll fall out of our do while loop, and then we'll be at the next iteration of our for loop. So do you see that the valid data is being stored in our rainfall array? So rainfall sub 0 is 3.2, rainfall sub 1 is 0.55, rainfall sub 2 is 2.2, and so on. Okay, so after we have read in the rainfall amount and validated it, in that same for loop, we should go ahead and output our month array and our rainfall array data. So in our for loop, remember we have an index, or a counter that can be used as an index. The program should output the month, right justified in a field width of 10, and the corresponding rainfall, right justified in a field width of 6. So in other words, January is right justified in a field width of 10, and the 3.20 is right justified in a field width of 6. The program should calculate the highest and lowest amounts of rainfall and display the amounts and the corresponding month names. So we're going to add some functionality in here. We need to keep up with the most rainfall. We need to keep up with the least rainfall. We also have to keep up with where we're finding the most rainfall and the least rainfall so that we can use those as subscripts or indexes into our month array, just like we did on our last assignment. Okay, so not only should we output the most rainfall along with the month with the most rainfall and the least rainfall along with the month that had the least rainfall, we also have to output the total amount of rainfall. So when you hear total, you should think accumulator. Inside our loop, we need to make use of an accumulator variable, and we need to accumulate the rainfall as we read it in. In other words, once we fall out of our validation loop and we have valid data, we need to go ahead and add that rainfall sub I, if I is our counter, to our accumulator variable. You can use total, sum, whatever you would like as your accumulator. Now, when we have accumulated all of the data in our accumulator, we then have everything we need to compute the average. The average needs to be computed when you fall out of the loop. It will be your accumulator divided by the number of months. There's 12 months in a year, so you're going to divide your accumulator by 12 to compute the average rainfall for the year. One thing I wanted to tell you about finding the most rainfall and the least rainfall and the month with the most rainfall and the month with the least rainfall is that you really only need to save the index of the highest and the index of the lowest in order to output these two lines of information. For example, in this output, the month that had the most rainfall, well, that was September. These are parallel arrays, so therefore the index of the highest can be used as the subscript for both the month and the rainfall array. So in other words, month subindex of highest and rainfall subindex of highest will output the appropriate information for this line of output. Likewise, you can utilize index of lowest to keep up with where in this array you found the least rainfall. So in this example, the least rainfall was in May, and it was 0.24 inches. I kept up with that by using index of lowest. Index of lowest is 4. Therefore, I can use that as my subscript into my month array. So in other words, month subindex of lowest is May, and rainfall subindex of lowest is 0.24. I hope this hint helps you simplify your code. It's just a simpler way to keep up with finding the month and the actual rainfall that is the highest and the lowest. Okay, I'm not going to help you with the code in this one. I'm hoping you can get it by yourself. Of course, if you have trouble, you can send me an email with questions. Make sure that you've attempted to write the program by yourself and try to let me know what the trouble is.